we are very happy to have Roger here with us again. Many of us were here when Roger spoke to us earlier, before COVID, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So we still remember all those really inspiring views, ideas, analysis. So we know each other for a long time from Kiel, and Roger is taught in many places, still doing research and teaching, advising powerful people. Yes, so we are here to listen, Roger, to talk about the crisis of capitalism in our times, and if there is anything, what is to be done.
So yeah, well thank you for that. Obviously, I'm going to make a lot of comments, and I would hope that you will interrupt and ask for clarification and join in, because obviously, as always, there are more questions than answers. And the other thing I say these days is, hello, oh, hi guys. The other thing I say is I apologise for being old, because I'm getting old and it's kind of embarrassing. But I point out that although I'm old, I'm still younger than the American president. And I'm younger than the previous American president. And I'm younger than the next American president. And I'm also younger than the Pope. So, but disturbingly, I'm a similar age to the men who run Brazil, India, China, and Russia. So probably half the world's population are ruled over by old men. And actually, that's not unusual. But what it means is that we lived through, or I lived through, the same world experiences that they did. And whatever they say about keeping in touch with reality, most people's politics and analysis is born in their 20s. And then they don't forget. So the key to Biden, Putin, and all the others is what happened to them all those years ago. And I was alive and, well, maybe not that, but anyway. So that has some purchase. Okay, so this is going to be, well, I gave a talk a few years ago, and at the end of it, the man said, but where's the hope, Roger? Because it's quite miserable, this stuff. But then the answer is there's not much. So that's why I thought I'd start with this picture. Can you see it all right? I can make this a little larger. Tech help, tech help. Tech help. Is that any better?
Oh, thank you, Ben.
Tech help. So there's the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which you'll all be familiar with, and from the book of Revelation. And if you remember, the sacred scroll of all knowledge was sealed. And the Lamb of God opens the four seals, the first of the seven seals. And these guys come out. War on a red horse, famine on a black horse, conquest on a white horse, and death on a pale horse, sometimes referred to as disease. And now, of course, there's climate change. And of course, climate change doesn't have a horse because they've all died. So they just creep around on their bellies. So that's the reason I start with that, is because it's powerful. And if we look around the world today, even if we look beyond Finsbury Park and Haringey, and even beyond Islington, I hate to say it, this is what we find. There's war in Sudan and Ethiopia. 8 million people are dying of starvation. That's not counting all the other millions everywhere else. Conquest, or attempt at conquest. And of course death. Premature death. Even in the UK, the life expectancy has fallen in the last 10 years for the first time in 100 years. Now, some of us here, I'm glad to say, are fighting this trend and keeping it alive. But if we add climate change, which you could just argue is all of this anyway, it tells us that even a long time ago, the people who wrote this stuff understood the human condition. They understood the difficulties of overcoming impulses that destroy each other. The impulses that take more than you need. And the famous British political philosopher Thomas Hobbes gave us this example. There's two men and there's one huge mushroom and they're starving. Now he wrote this in the middle of the 17th century. He said they're starving and they fight and one kills the other, eats the mushroom, but he can only eat half and he's full. So Hobbes said, why didn't they agree to share it? And he said, in the most famous ending of the book, because the natural life of man is nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, human nature is such, you can't allow it. So he said you needed an autocratic state, what he called the Leviathan, to control it. So he advocated autocracy. He advocated that humans can't be allowed to behave like this, so they have to give all their rights, all their authority and power to an overriding state that would control this impulse. Now that was one version, and we can look at the tendency to autocracy in the modern world, the retreat from democratic principles, that it's not an idle, just mad people wanting more power. It's about this fundamental view. Can we be trusted? Who do we trust not to kill each other for the mushroom that we could have shared? Where's the rationality? So these are tricky stuff. So, of course, one of the features of this is inequality, and as my favourite author Lewis Carroll always says, begin at the beginning. I know it sounds obvious, but in politics and political debate, most of us don't begin at the beginning. We get muddled and start in the middle. And in the beginning, when we look around at the fundamental material existence of people, it's inequality. It's just staggering. It's absolutely staggering. I started writing a paper on plutocracy, ruled by the rich. And I thought this would be quite interesting because so many, I mean, our Prime Minister is a billionaire. Trump is, I thought, there's so many rich people. And I thought, and then I went back over the last 300 years and I realised, actually, nothing's changed. Most of the leaders of most countries in the last year have been enormously rich people. In other words, the inequality is staggering in its sustainability. And it's just grotesque. I mean, we were just talking in the cafe. I was on the radio about the junior hospital doctors' strike. And they earn about £1,000 a week, junior doctors. And they were saying, aren't they greedy, asking for more? And I pointed out, there's the best paid woman in England earns £5 million a week. 5 million a week. That's her salary. And they say doctors are greedy and they earn 1,000 a week. So how can, I mean, it's staggering. The inequality is absolutely staggering. And last week we found out that in the American tech billionaires earn $1 million an hour. $1 million an hour. So by the time we leave here tonight, they'll be a lot richer. It's staggering because I was also on the radio about Amazon saying that at £13.50 an hour for their warehouse workers was a generous payment. Amazon. And Amazon, of course, is one of the tech companies that pays its senior people this. And they were saying the workforce are greedy and going to ruin the company because they want £15 an hour and they're earning $1 million an hour. So the inequality is staggering. Staggering. And when you go, of course, to countries like India, where during the recent drought, one of the rich guys filled his swimming pool with champagne. His swimming pool, because he couldn't get the water. And then you go to the slums of Mumbai, and people have nothing. And I used to be a professor in a country in Africa, Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in Africa. And literally, you're driving along, and the kids, they still live in a mud hut. They have nothing. No electricity, no water, no healthcare, no education, nothing. And then you go past the presidential palace, and I said, oh, that's a nice palace for the president. They say he doesn't use it anymore. He's got a bigger, better one somewhere else. So, we know all this, but it still amazes me the extent of it, of the inequality. And one of the things is that the famous Irish revolutionary, James Connolly, this is a paraphrase, but he more or less summed up the whole of what we need to know from this phrase, that every child that is born, and this is important, isn't it? Because when the child is born, and I'm speaking from someone who has 12 grandchildren, 3 born last year, I think, maybe. Okay? So, every child, when that child, the moment that child is born, if we, as long as we don't live in Alabama, we assume that when they're born, they become humans. They have rights. And this is the wonderful thing that we understand, that as soon as you're born, when you exist, the little baby, this baby has rights. And that's politics. And it has entitled to a fair share. I mean, when Prince George was born, those of you who are monarchists, which I'm sure you all are, and fervently follow the royal family, I thought that when Prince George was born, I looked at him and thought, is he getting a fair share? Or more than a fair share? Because then you see these little kids being born in Ethiopia, in rural Pakistan, in Afghanistan. So that's morality. The fairness is a moral question. And we shouldn't shun from that. And then, what is it you're having a share of? And it's what used to be called, you used to call it man's worldly goods, so we can't call it that now, so we just call it worldly goods. And the famous Pilgrim's Progress, these famous Christian stories of the road to a better life. The reason they're important for us is because they're the basis for the socialist movement in Europe. Much of the socialist movement in Europe comes from the Christian version of going to a better life. And in Pilgrim's Progress, the pilgrim is going to the celestial city, the better life, the socialist outcome. And you know, in The Wizard of Oz, the famous song about the rainbow, yeah, where the rainbow ends, that was written by a famous communist, and he was writing about socialism. And he said, where the rainbow ends, that's our socialist thing. And he wrote that deliberately for The Wizard of Oz. He was called Yip Hobo. So it's interesting that these things run through all our life. They run through our culture, our stories, and what we want for our children and grandchildren and our friends and others. And it's economics. So if we take that the economics, politics and morality are all interlinked in every child that is born, every human that is born, they have all of this. And yet, this is what we're saying they're entitled to. This is the basis of a socialist position. Must be. So then we look around at the inequality. How have we designed societies that can generate this intense level of inequality? Not just generate it, but excuse it. And in fact, we praise the idle rich and despise the idle poor. You know, when super rich people are prancing about and say, oh, look at that, isn't that great? And then the homeless on the streets outside, oh, aren't they lazy? So we admire. So these guys, and you all know about the actual inequality. It's not just income, which we've been discussing, but it's also the inequality of wealth is even greater than the inequality of income. I mean, staggering. You know, when they say, oh, the richest guy is worth, you know, $100 billion, and the average asset worth of the billion people who live in India is about $20. It's just staggering. The numbers are staggering, aren't they? So it's wealth and income, but of course that then becomes what some people have called the spirit level. You know the spirit level? And they're saying it's like that because this inequality then spills over into more desperate everyday matters: health, social care, education, housing, utilities, and opportunity. And the Labour Party in this country, which is not dissimilar to the Labour parties in what's left of the equivalent Labour Party in Germany, France, and most of Europe, they talk mainly about equality of opportunity. They don't talk about equality of outcomes, but of opportunity. I will give you the opportunity to have a healthier, better life, but it's up to you to grab it. That's not good enough. That's just not good enough. But what this leads to, obviously, is a struggle over the worldly goods. And this struggle is not only an actual struggle, so land grabbing, whether the Bullock knows 10 times more than I do, whether the war in Ukraine and Gaza is all about land, grabbing land. You know, the border disputes between China and India, as if they don't have enough land, is about land. So is it the fight over worldly goods? It's land, it's capital, it's raw materials. Yeah? I mean, we're even so mad we're sending probes to the moon to see if there's a raw material we can use. And of course, it is a fight over labour. Who controls labour? How much labour is there? What type of labour is available? Immigration, which I will come on to, is about controlling and fighting over the worldly goods. So there's a fight. In other words, you don't just end up with this inequality. There's a struggle for it. And that's at the heart of what we understand explains the dynamic of society. When we look back and say what's changed, what hasn't changed, why has it changed faster here, not there, it's often to do with the outcome of struggles. And some of the struggles are bitter and to the death. And others may be more polite, but are still as serious. We should never underestimate the importance of struggle in all aspects of it. I've just written a piece about a colleague who's even older than me, and he was writing about famous strikes in British history. And I said, it's not just the strikes that we fight about, it's who tells the story of the strike that we fight about. And recently, if you've seen on the telly, there's been some nostalgic pieces on the famous miners' strike of 1984. Who gets to tell the story? You know, the famous phrase, the first casualty of war is truth, and the victor gets to tell the story. And that's what happens in our schools and in our TV programs and in our newspapers. Who is telling the story of what actually happened? And it's the victors. And we have to have a voice that tells the other story. So the battle, the struggle isn't just in the factory, it's in the telling of the story about what happens. That's the intellectual struggle, which is important. Obviously, as an academic, I'd have to say that, but it's not just that. Okay, so then, we don't have time to go into all the detail, but clearly the most visible struggle. It's funny, people tend not to, you know, if you live in a normal house in London or whatever, you tend not to say, ooh, I'd like to live in a £10 million mansion. But what you do tend to say is, I'd like to have 10% more pay. So a lot of the most visible struggles, and the ones we've seen in this country and other countries in recent months, and the current one with the farmers in many European countries, is to do with how income is distributed. And income comes only in three forms: profits, rent, and wages. That's it. There's no other income. Now, all the complicated add-ons are just part of that picture. So pensions are your wages, but you defer them. Dividends are part of profits. So whatever we call them, there's just three types of income. And that's where the heart of the struggle is. And we know that within this massive distribution problem, that most workers get less than most owners. So we have a world which in Europe certainly, and in other parts of the world in the last 20 years, ownership has been more heavily rewarded than work. So owners have got more money than earners. And we know this because the actual distribution of wages in the economy has shrunk. So the total amount of money going to working class has declined as a proportion of all the gross national income, or gross domestic product. And within that quite complicated picture, we then have all those other ones: age, gender, ethnicity, ability, region, national citizenship. I mean, it all gets very complicated. And I was giving a talk recently to the Railway Union, the RMT, and I started by asking the delegates to explain, in the Dutch elections recently, a far-right guy did very well. And he wants to cut unemployment benefit, disability benefit, and he wants to outlaw gay people. And they had an interview with a gay man who was disabled and unemployed. So you've got a disabled, unemployed gay man who voted for a politician who said, I'm going to cut your benefit, I'm going to cut your disability benefit, and I'm going to put you in prison for being gay. And they said, why did you vote for him? So I put that to the, and he said, he's one of us. National identity was more important than the fact he was voting to make himself even poorer and even more an outcast in his own society. So we'll come on to this notion of identity, but these things do matter, these splits between the generations or the genders and so on, and people who played the identity politics card, who said the most important thing is I'm black or white or woman or old, are doing a massive disservice to the fight for greater equality. It's not about equality, because the best paid person in Britain is a woman. The person who earns 5 million a week is a woman. So if you're a woman earning £15 an hour, and what have you got in common with it? Nothing. You can't say it's gendering. I've got more in common with a multi-millionaire who earns, she pays herself 300 million a year, every year. 300 million a year. What's she got in common with people earning 15? Nothing. But if you say, well, we women have to stay together, no. So all of this becomes part of the aim. And the problem about inequality, if it persists, it leads to insecurity. And the interesting thing is, the insecurity is both. So people on the wrong side of the inequality are insecure because they're not sure about paying their heating bills. They're not sure about paying their food bills. They're not sure about all this. So they become insecure. And insecure is a really dangerous position because you turn on each other. You turn on each other and not on the real enemy. But also the rich become more insecure because they've got so much money. They're not stupid. They know all of this enormous income and wealth is predicated on the mass of people not slitting their throats at night. And that's quite real. That's real because if you go through history, that's what's happened from time to time. We have uprisings and we slit the throat of the rich. So the rich know And that's why when you go to a posh school, you get taught about all of this, because you'll be told, be careful, you're rich at their expense and they're going to come and slit your throat in the night. So rich people become more insecure. And you see this particularly in America, don't you, with gated communities and their private police, and everyone's got a gun.
Tons of guns.
Of course we've got a gun. If I was a rich American, I'd have a gun, because these other people are poor, and somewhere deep inside them all, they know this isn't just. They know this is immoral. They know this is unfair. And while it may be individual acts of violence, it's nonetheless representative of it. And the more the richer you become, and the more brutal you become in your suppression of opposition, the more scared you become that they're going to take it away. So it's not just poor who are insecure, it's rich. And this, in my view, provides us with desperate instability. So the inequality breeds insecurity, and the insecurity breeds instability. And that's why you get the electoral fluctuations, where you get people moving to the far right, you get people being disillusioned, you get cults, you get in America this enormous religious reaction to women's rights particularly, but to all rights. And this is because the world becomes unstable. Internally, externally, and with this instability comes war. And the four horsemen. Because while what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine is terrible, what's happening in Sudan and Ethiopia is worse. 8 million people displaced, 8 million living in starvation in tents and are displaced by the civil wars. Civil war fought between factions funded by people outside. And the instability, they play off it because the view is somebody will benefit from the instability. Someone will come out as the victor. And so we see this in Libya. Yeah, we see it in Myanmar. We see it in all sorts of places. And as I said, because we can talk in grand schemes, but when it comes down to individuals, you get personal life, you get an increase in mental health crisis. It doesn't just happen. It's not just that we identify more mental health problems than we used to. It's that actually more people have mental health problems. But why? And there is this notion that there's a societal wide problem. That people get depressed, they read the news, get worried. And family life can break down. People pursuing a better life, immigration, migration. I mean, I know it's not funny, but it always amuses me about immigration because, you know, we say, well, foreigners coming over. But if you go back to the early 19th century Britain, where we come from in Stoke-on-Trent, there are two towns, one called Fenton and one called Longton. Right? Very original names. And they're about 3 miles apart. And they used to make pottery. That was the major employment. And the Longton potters made very high quality stuff. And the Fenton potters made less good. Cheaper. So the Longton potters moved over to Fenton. 3 miles, all white, God-fearing Christians. And the Fenton people said, go back to Longton. They actually said it. Go back. You're foreigners. You don't speak the same. You look different. And they were 3 miles apart. So this notion of migrants, immigrants, has a long history. And we just invent differences to make it seem plausible. But of course this leads to not only the rise of the far right, which we've seen right across the world, but what's worse is its normalisation. So it's not just that these people are saying terrible things and that they're saying them increasingly loudly and that when they're saying them they have more and more support. It's that it becomes like normal political discourse. So 20 years, if Nazis in Germany went around speaking, they'd either be put in prison or laughed at. Now they're the second biggest party. So all of what they say and what they stand for is becoming normalised politics. The BBC interviews the head of the French fascists like she was a normal person. And when they say, oh, you're a racist, she says, no, I'm not a racist, I'm sorry. BBC, you don't understand. And they say, oh, we're sorry we called you a racist. Because obviously you're telling us the truth. Huh? You know, if they were interviewing Hitler now, they would say, now Mr. Hitler, what do you really think is going on? Well, I'd like to say that some of my supporters may be at the extreme, but you can be sure I'll look after all Germans, one way or the other. And the BBC would say, oh, thank you so much for coming on our show. And then they'd have a little jingle. So they're normalising it. And we see this in America. Look in America. It's really the whole women's rights, the whole thing. I mean, by the way, while the headline is quite right about women's rights, trade union membership in America is collapsing to virtually nothing because they are also having their rights destroyed. But they don't get the headlines. So this is normal now. So that's a great danger. You have to tell me when I need to stop talking, otherwise we'll be here till midnight. Okay, so we talk about neoliberalism, and we don't have time on this talk to go into its details. What we essentially know by neoliberalism, I mean, the great historian Hobsbawm was very against the use of the word neo. It just means new. You know, neo-Nazis just means new Nazis. Neoliberalism just means new. And he hated the word post as well, particularly when used as postmodernist, or it just means after. He said, why are we Latinising these things? Let's just call them what they are. This is a new liberalism. What they mean by new liberalism is what used to be called, you know, the economics of the firm, right? The economics of the firm is simply that in a free market, with no state intervention, no regulations, the economy would thrive. That's all. And then we discovered that wasn't true. So we had 100 years of saying, no. And then in the 1980s, they came back and said, actually, it's better than state intervention, so everything's got to be privatised, everything's got to be competitive, and we'll let grip because that will grow the economy and will be win-win-win. So that's all. They're just going back to the original neoclassical theory of the firm, it used to be called. But what they discovered when they spread it out is neoliberalism, surprise, surprise, has winners and losers. And bigger surprise, there are very few winners and enormous numbers of losers. And so, when, as I said, you have a lot of losers and a few winners, the winners have to make sure that the loser's voice is removed. So the democratic deficit doesn't just come by accident. It comes as part of the defence against uprisings. And we see it in corruption and nepotism. You know, when I teach, I used to teach in business schools, not only in this country, but I was a visiting professor in Beijing, in China, in Africa, or even embarrassed to say it in Sweden. God help me, that really was grim. If you want smug and complacent. So, and I used to say to them, these were young students studying business, so I'd say, get your book, look up in the book, corruption. And they said, it's not there. I said, it's everywhere. But it's not taught. We're not taught that corruption is not an accidental side effect of a few bad people, but is at the heart of the neoliberal project. It has to be corrupt, otherwise it doesn't function. And what about nepotism? They say, oh, what do you mean? I said, well, I don't know, but I thought Prince Charles was the son of the Queen. And how did he get the job of king? Because his mum was queen. That's nepotism, isn't it? And how did Murdoch get that? How did Murdoch do it? In fact, almost all the major companies, they give it to their kids, and And there's a good reason, even though my youngest son is here, is because at the end of the day, you can only trust family. You can't trust. If I'm a totally corrupt, mad business person like Rupert Murdoch, I can't allow an outsider to run the business because they'll put me in jail. So I have to do it to my son, because if I go to jail, he goes to jail. Right? And Trump wants to do that with his children, except they hate him so much. But that's the model, isn't it? It's not an accidental thing, but it's hugely important. You know, and we see it in politics. I mean, Bush, his son became president. Bush. Look at even the Philippines. You know, some of the most appalling people, and their children and grandchildren get elected because. Anyway, so that's part of it. And part of that is the drift to autocracy, where rights are removed, the long cherished rights are removed. And of course, one of the arguments which Bullitt talks about is nation states. So within this, there's the fantasy of the nation, that somehow if we leave the EU, which I was totally in favour of, by the way, I know a lot of people have criticised me since. The idea is of the nation state, that it controls its destiny. Make America great again. Yes? Let the nation state. But the reality is, these nation states have little control over their destinies. And it doesn't matter, in my view, never did, whether you're in the EU or not in the EU. You don't have control over your destinies because huge corporations, enormous flows of capital can destroy you overnight, as our most brilliant Prime Minister, Liz Truss, illustrated. Within 2 days, she had generated a flood of capital away from Britain and destroyed us overnight. In fact, what she suggested wasn't stupid, it was going for growth, okay, but they didn't like it. So the notion that we're in control, the nation, and yet that is the thing that's projected to most people. Nations, their destiny, their control, win back control, take back control is a familiar political phrase, take back control. But labour and capital, two of the most important factors of production, don't understand nations. Capitalists and capital will flow across national borders, and if you put up barriers, they still flow, as we've seen in the Panama Papers and other WikiLeaks. Our poor friend Julian Assange, you know, is dying because he released information, and the worst information was about capital flow, about how the super rich generate money and push it around beyond boundaries. But also labour flows back to immigration, back to migration. You can't stop it. It's no good putting up a barrier, a wall. They want to, I mean, in 2024 we're building walls to stop people moving around. But it's a factor of production. And in this country, we have chronic staff shortages. So labour will flow or not flow, and it will find its level and find its price in wages or capital in profits. So these are immense forces, the flow of labour, the flow of capital, and they're not concerned with national borders. But of course that then means the second half of my talk, what is to be done, it partly comes from a new world order. In other words, if you have the failure of globalisation, which we seem to have, do we then have a new world order? And is the new world order one in which nations are less important? Worse. Doesn't mean, because it's new, doesn't mean it's better. It could be a worse world order. Now, when the Soviet Union disappeared, people said, right, we're going to hit the, what they call Pax Americanus, it's going to be a world of America. But now they're saying it's three ways: EU, China, and America. And they're saying, but that's not sustainable, because there'll be wars, there'll be frictions, they'll drive down the price of labour and drive down the benefits of capital, so they'll destroy growth in the world economy. But what you can't stop is the concentration of capital, what's known as the accumulation of capital, and that flows into smaller and smaller groups. So things like the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. The reason why King Saud isn't listed as one of the richest men, as the richest man in the world, which he is, far richer than the American tech billionaires, is because it's not in his name. Now this is an old trick. This is a trick that goes back 1,000 years. You put your money in your cousin's wife's name in order to avoid tax. So all the Saudis are doing is saying it's not the king's, it's a sovereign wealth fund, which he controls, but all the money goes in there. So they don't appear as the richest people in the world, but they are, aren't they? They control trillions, not millions. I don't even know what a trillion is, but I'll say the word. What did that? So it's a lot of noughts. So I don't know what the new world ought to be. What, as I've put there, post-idealism or next. Okay, so we move on. And one of the features that a lot of people discuss around the New World Order and where we're heading is the paradox of secrecy. And is it a paradox? But anyway, it amuses me that the more information there is, the more secret we are. So there's more information, it comes quicker, it's more accessible. I love my mobile phone, you know, once Ben taught me how to use it. I love using it. It's accessible, it's quick, I can find out the cricket score, or the football score, the important things of life. But there's also more secrets in the world, as the Panama Papers and WikiLeaks showed. So there's also, with more information, more lies, more fiction, and I'm looking forward greatly to the increase in fake AI. I can't imagine anything more absolutely entertaining than seeing President Biden look 20 years younger and pronouncing France correctly. We all know it's fake, won't we? But AI is, I think, hilarious. I was giving a talk to the School Teachers Union, and they've got massive problems, low wages, staff shortages, falling ceilings, and all they wanted to talk about was AI. They said it's going to do us out of a job, you know. Nah, of course it's not. It's going to give you twice as many jobs. Yeah? But it's there, isn't it? So, conspiracy theories, fake AI, and people get very concerned, and this deals with what we call the culture wars, or what the right-wing press call wokeism. Now this culture wars and wokeism, am I allowed to talk about that for a few minutes?
Of course, yes.
Okay, so, well, I don't know how boring it is.
Yeah, 10 more minutes.
Okay, so I don't know how boring this is, but the culture wars and wokeism is very interesting. At one level it's so silly and stupid that you don't know what to do, you know, because there's GB News. Now I appear on GB News, they interview me about strikes on GB News, and people say, what are you doing, Roger? Well, except for the other guy they interview is the General Secretary of the Train Drivers Union. So if he's prepared to go on it, I can go on it. And also that other one, what's the other weird TV?
Talk TV.
Talk TV. I'm on Talk TV. Hilarious. And they're all going on about being woke and cultural. So, and you say, what does it mean? And they say, oh, well, the left won't allow you to speak. And I said, well, that's great, because most of my life as a left-winger, I wasn't allowed to speak by the right wing. They used to ban me all over the place. Maybe that wasn't my politics, but anyway. Yeah? And now they're complaining when they're no platform. I mean, it's just drivel, isn't it? I mean, it's real drivel. And in America, you know, they have all this stuff about the banning books that have sexual content or violence. And you know about the guy who actually, this is a true story. This is a deeply religious school, and he said he wanted the Bible banned because there's sex and violence in it. And they agreed. So in a deeply religious Christian school, they've agreed to ban the Bible because there's sex and violence in it. I mean, they're that mad, aren't they? So at one level it's just mad stupid, but the other level it's very, very serious and very, very dangerous, because what they use it for is to undermine any notion of progressive opposition. So anybody who says anything that is about human rights, anything about immigrant rights, anything about moving greater equality, all these things we've discussed, that phrase about the child born, they don't want that. They don't want that discussed. So what they're trying to do is build a massive wall which stops the debate before it starts. So it's both got a trivial, silly basis where you can just shoot it down anywhere, but it's underneath that, and part of that is an attack on Marxism itself. So whether you're a Marxist or not, Marxism still provides us with an alternative analysis of some merit. Now, it may be wrong, but it's an alternative analysis with merit. And they don't want that. That's partly what's behind this. Any talk whatsoever. And this is where newspapers like The Guardian are no better than the Daily Express, because they go along with that. So basically, they want to squeeze out of debate any notion of socialism, Marxism, any serious critique of a capitalist system. They just want it to be trivial around the edges of capitalism. Oh, that's a bit unfair, that's a bit naughty, that's wrong. But they don't want any root and branch analysis that could actually say this is systematic and it's creating systematic inequality, poverty and hardship. And as I said, the more secrets, the more hidden information, the more complex the scamming, although actually the Panama Papers, I mean, it wasn't complex at all. They just held a huge amount of information about the incredibly rich not paying their taxes, and they just held it. I mean, it was just lying around basically. And someone said, "Ooh, what's that?" But what comes with corruption? One of the things about corruption, which is why in China the current leadership is trying to get rid of it but not succeeding, is that it undermines democracy. It undermines ordinary people's rights. Because if we vote for somebody, let's say, who's going to spend more money on improving the potholes or the hospitals, and then that money goes in your pocket, that undermines the democratic will, and then it breeds a superficial cynicism where everybody says, oh, well, they're all rubbish. All politicians are the same. They're all rubbish. They're all liars. They're all cheats. And on that, we don't vote. And that's what they want. They want an alienated and disengaged working class who believe all the systems are against them, who believe nobody represents them. And that makes them not only vulnerable to the right-wing demagogue who comes along and says, I'm one of you, I'll save you. But it also means if they don't fall for that, they just turn inwards and they don't participate. And we've seen that right across the level of trade union membership is falling, but not only membership, but the number of active trade unions, shop stewards, is falling. The number of people participating in local council activities is falling. Now, there are obviously very good counterexamples, particularly in some parts of South America, which has always had very strong community activities. But overall, it's a problem, and we have the dilemma of totalitarian democracy, the contradictions. So I'll skip ideology and just go on to what is to be done. So I believe that we, progressive people, people who are critical of capitalism, our first job is to join up the dots, because we're confronted with an enormous amount of complex information. A lot of it contradictory, a lot of it not necessarily very robust. And what we have to do is try to join up the dots and make a picture. So if we see a struggle here, a victory there, a bad thing there, we can join up all the dots and the picture is there. And that's important because people need a picture. They can't just say, in my street, this is happening, or next door, this is happening. We've got to go beyond that. We've got to see beyond the secrets of the seventh veil. So I got a bit carried away with the biblical references there. But the seventh veil, obviously, is the bit where they finally unmask humanity for what it is. And and the rising racism. We've got to confront the aging population, you know, but it's like I'm to blame for getting old. I find that quite insulting, actually. So can you know, it's not my fault I'm getting old. And yet you read in the papers, the crisis in the NHS is old people. Sorry? I didn't know we were a crisis in the NHS. Or in Japan, where there's more, you know, over 80s than under 10s. Sorry, I mean, that's not our fault. But it seemed like it's our fault, and we're a problem. So poor people are a problem, old people are a problem, mentally ill people are a problem. Sorry, whose problem? We're not problems, we're people. So the whole way it's presented is of that type. And of course, the climate crisis is appalling. And what do we do in this country? We open a new oil franchise, we pollute our rivers. I mean, when I was at school, we understood about polluting rivers. we knew how to stop it. And we've gone backwards, haven't we? How can we explain that our rivers are more polluted now than 20 years ago? Now, we know we can say it's the water company's fault, but how did we allow it to happen? How are we so disengaged and disenfranchised from controlling our own environment that we allow them to privatise water, we allow them to sell it off for foreign companies as a milch cow, just making money for doing nothing. We allow them to lie every year that they're going to invest in cleaning it up. And we do it, we allow that. And that's a question. Why is it that we're allowing? Why aren't we on the streets demonstrating against river pollution? Against cuts in the NHS? We're not. It's very strange, isn't it? The farmers are there, but most people aren't. And that's, I think, important. So we end up, as always in these talks, with the most important thing to be done is to be clear that the major denominator is your class position in society. Not your gender, not your ethnicity, not your status, but your class position, which is an objective economic category. That is, you don't own land and you don't own capital. And therefore you work for a living one way or another, or you wish to work for a living one way or the other. And that's it, it's not that complicated, it's not that weird, is it? To say, I'm not the same as someone who owns land, I'm not the same as someone who owns capital. I work for a living, and now I'm retired, I get a pension, which was my wages deferred for when I was old. It's not difficult, but that is the common denominator. And it's overall the working class that are the wrong end of the neoliberal globalised economy. So the first thing, and the most important thing, is self-awareness. We have to recognise that above all else, we are part of a common category. That, I mean, we use the word class, I mean, we use it, or it's just another word for category. We're a category of humans. And we're a category of humans defined by our most important thing, which is how do we survive in the world? How do we actually survive? How do we get clean water, food, and so on? And we survive by going to work, by paying, earning money to pay the bills too. So that's what we all have in common. And that has that must be regenerated as the most important factor, because that commonality, those of us on the receiving end of an exploiting global rich, have to be seen as the uniting, because that's the basis for unity in this country and across the world, that we should be shoulder to shoulder with all workers in every country and not allow them to turn us against each other. And that seems to me the most important, what is to be done, what people used to call the needs of the hour. What are the needs of the hour? What, not fantasy, what do we need today, this hour, to do? And I think it's hugely important that, and one of the things that stops us going back to a united working class movement is that we have old-fashioned and outdated views of what working class is. So sometimes we talk about the industrial working class. You know, it was coal miners, but it wasn't teachers. But it is teachers. They're part of the working class. And if you stick to that old-fashioned one, then you have a shrinking working class. And we have to recognise that the working class has changed in its composition. So there's more white-collar workers, more professional workers, more even self-employed Uber Eats delivery workers whose actual employment status may not be super clear, but it's clearly part of the working class. If we don't recognise that changing composition, we'll be stuck in a rut from the 1950s where you're only a worker if you go to work in a factory or coal mine. Yeah, exactly. So, once we understand that, and we go back to the basics of unifying that, because by identifying our common enemy is not immigrants, it's not old people, it's not mentally ill people. Our common enemy are the people who own the means of production and who dominate the globe in that pursuit. But if we don't act, if we don't start this fight back, the nature of capitalist society is uncertainty. It thrives off uncertainty. It lives by uncertainty. It is a cost, risk, benefit analysis, and therefore it has to be seen as a systemic fight against the system and its manifestations. Now, the final slide here is, a lot of times we get depressed. You know, I wish I was back in the 80s or the 70s where I could fight the good fight, but we don't choose the time and place, the terrain upon which to fight. We have to look beyond traditional modes and means. Organised strikes are hugely important, as we've seen. They shifted the debate in Britain. The farmers' disputes throughout Europe are shifting the debates about priorities. But they don't go far enough. They end. And so we still have to be active throughout all these different institutions. Protests, riots, we have protests, we have riots, we have sabotage, we have pop-up anarchistic stunts. I'm not in favour of throwing acid on a great masterpiece. It's not theirs to destroy. Yeah, there's no cause so just as you destroy a Picasso. Why would you? I mean, Picasso was painting for all of us. He was a communist, he was a humanist. He was trying to express the pain and hurt and the reality of it all. Why would you destroy it? What gives you the right? So I call them pop-up anarchists, and they're quite annoying, actually. But at the end of the day, it's this only the recognition of internationalism. We have to reinvent internationalism. We have to stop. And the EU had nothing to do with internationalism. Being in or out of the EU has nothing to do with it. Because the EU actually is destroying internationalism, because it's just substituting a nation state for a fake federated state. So it doesn't improve relationship. You go, the French and Italians still hate each other. You know, the fact they've been in the EU for 40 years is irrelevant. It hasn't done anything as it claimed on that basis. In fact, it hinders internationalism, in my view, because it creates a fake bureaucratic form of what we used to call brotherly, the brotherhood of man, or now it's called hood of man. Okay? So, I haven't really got anything new to say about it. We've got to restate the class analysis. We've got to recognise the commonality of class interest, and we've got to go and recognise the best forms of it. And we can't preach to others. So in Britain, it may still be that the Labour Party, for all its faults, is the best form of opposing the system. But in other countries, that doesn't mean that's true. And we shouldn't preach to others about what. But we should support and be sympathetic to it. And in the end, we have to look at, as I said, coordinated international action, because no country can fight this on their own. So we end up with John Donne's over-quoted phrase, "No man is an island unto himself." So no workers' struggle is isolated and an island unto itself. It has to be linked to the international movements. And however frail they may be, we need to stick with them. So I think that's enough, Bullet. You've heard my voice long enough. So thank you. Comrades.
Any comments, any questions?
I have just one issue which I was never able to find a real good answer. Now, I am a member of Unite the Union. And first amicus, then Unite the Union, and I'm still a member of one of the branches. Now, during the heydays, we used to discuss the unity of working classes internationally and so on, but Unite has always mentioned American Metal Workers Union as a union to have brotherly relations. I look at the other unions, they also look at the American unions, but not CGT, not EMEK in Germany. They are not looking at Europe, they are looking at America. What is the reason? I have never solved this problem. Because Europe, for me, Europe always is nearer to England than America. That's my thinking.
No, it's very important question. I mean, there's sort of two fairly sort of superficial answers. One is to do with language. They speak English, and the French don't, damn them. So, I mean, it's just easier to communicate on that basis. Another, of course, was to do with the World Congress of Trade Unions. And as you know, after the Second World War, the World Federation of Trade Unions, free trade unions, you know, and the Soviet unions and the Americans and everyone joined together for a few years. And then when the Cold War kicked off, there was the split between the American-funded and the American-based trade unions and the Soviet. And there's a very good book by a man called Anthony Carew on the way in which the CIA infiltrated European trade unions. And he goes into great detail about the American trade unions, the AFL-CIO, the equivalent of RTUC. They sent fraternal delegates to the Italian unions, the French unions, the British unions, but all of these fraternal delegates were actually paid for by the CIA and were linked to the CIA, and they were there to split and undermine the left within the European unions and to drive out the communists in order to put the people they wanted to be in charge, because they understood that the European trade unions had close links with the European left parties. So if you could turn the unions, you could turn the parties. So they invested enormous amounts of money, and this guy goes into all the details explaining exactly how that happened and how, as the Cold War progressed, and they did this in Africa as well. It wasn't just in European countries, because some of the British unions, actually, including the Transport and General Workers, one of the forerunners of Unite, and the Engineering Union, had actually quite close ties with African trade unions, particularly those in the ex-colonies like Nigeria, where they had big railway unions. So it wasn't just American unions, it was English-speaking African nations also had close links with some of the British unions, who had actually sent people out to construct trade unionism in the image of the British trade union movement, with the same, I've just been looking at it, they sent out in 1948, the TUC produced model rules for the colonies. And they actually sent it to all the colonies in Africa, the West Indies, and elsewhere, even to Hong Kong. And the idea was to create this. So there was a massive involvement of the Americans. And the American AFL-CIO spent a lot of time particularly with the English because of the language and because they saw the British unions in the 50s and 60s as the most powerful union bloc in Europe. So there's a good political reason for that American link-up. And and then as you know, trade unions can be quite lazy, particularly with foreign policies, and they tend just to continue those relationships as they come and go. But you're quite right. And the other thing is, clearly they wouldn't link up with CGT because it's an overtly communist trade union, and they wouldn't have that. No, the TUC and no British trade union would do that. The only, the IG Metall is a slightly different story, they're not equivalent. So basically, it's an old story, isn't it? It's Cold War, American influence through the Cold War, splitting them and trying to make sure that they had links. And once you've got the links on a personal, somebody that's very personal, then it continued on that road. But it's not true to say that it was only Americans. We had strong links with African nations as well. I don't know if Alan, he was a member of the Print Workers Union and then Amicus and was an official of the union. Whether you know more about this?
I don't know more about it, but there was in the old days the print union with IG Medium, and a lot of international work took place with the Americans as well.
And was that just about free trips abroad?
Mainly for me, yeah, as an executive, it's about free trips and spending money. No, but the interesting thing was that much of that collapsed through corruption rather than politics, which is really interesting. You know, just spending money. Using it as a being president of a European confederation was like a gift to somebody who was, I won't say fucking useless because that would be rude, but from the British trade union movement, where they want to move on from being a general secretary, they'll put them in Europe.
Yeah, but
and then they have a huge salary and a huge pension, and
yeah, I remember that.
Very dirty today. Sort of thinking 80s and 90s.
Yeah, once the Soviet Union collapsed, then the American interest, because it went out right through until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the CIA intervention through the American unions in European politics, trade unions. But once the Soviet Union died down and they thought the Cold War had ended, you know, for example, wrote a famous book, The End of History.
They went right into former Yugoslavia with loads of money, full-time posts in Bulgaria and Romania.
So post the collapse of the Soviets, the British TUC was at the forefront of educating Eastern Europeans on how to run unions, and they put an enormous amount of money. A lot came from America. So again, the Americans were desperate that if there were going to be residual unions in the former communist countries, they would look like British Europe. They didn't want the European style because they wanted the non-political British or weak political model. An enormous amount of money was spent. I mean,
and the AFL-CIO,
huge numbers of British trade unions went out to teach them how to run unions. They often gave it to the wrong people, so as Alan says, they often went to fake unions and the guys just ran off with the money. I mean, it was terrible, really. It was quite funny. You know, in Bulgaria particularly, some guy would just say, I'm the head of the union. Ah, here's money. And they'd just run off, because he wasn't. But they were so desperate to civilise the people. So that's part of that. And if you remember, I mean, certainly when Amicus became Amicus, it had quite a rhyme with leadership, and he was involved. And some of the TMG,
probably well recognised.
And even the Transport and General Workers, people forget. I mean, it was only recently in the run-up to Unite, the Transport and General Workers had a more progressive leadership.
Yeah.
By which time the international trade union movement was stagnating because the Americans decided they didn't need to fund it because there was no Soviet threat. So, I don't know, it's a partial explanation of what you're asking. But it wasn't just the Americans, it was any English-speaking, don't underestimate language barriers for British trade unionists.
Question is important not because of the organizational relations, but how shall we organize solidarity between different countries, working classes? If French yellow vest are doing lots of demonstrations, how shall we organize a solidarity action for them, with them here, for example, if the unions are not talking to each other? This is the basis.
Well, they do talk to each other. I mean, all the big British unions do have international offices, and they do have links, but they're a little bit hit and miss, But they can't organise their own protests. So solidarity with, they say the words. So at many conferences, I go to some union conferences, the TUC, they come up with a motion saying we support, but there's not a lot. Remember, in this country, union membership's down to maybe 12% in the private sector. I mean, down to 12, I've been one way it's 50%, it's now down to 10, 12% in the private sector. And that's nearly all the old utilities like gas, water, so on.
Also, alongside all this, in the merger mania that's taken place over the last 20 years, they've totally decimated political education. Totally decimated.
Yeah.
So there used to be a lot. So I still do, the railway union still has political education, and I'm a tutor. And I've been approached by 2 other white-collar unions who want to reinvent political education, and they've asked me to help. So maybe there's a little bit of awareness that you need to do that. But one of the hallmarks, as you know, of the British trade unions was to separate industrial from political struggle. And there's a wonderful, in 1924, 100 years ago, one of the great British historians, a man called G.D.H. Cole, who was also a great activist, and he said that the hallmark of true trade unionism is when industrial and political struggles come together. That was his thing, and he has a wonderful phrase which I can't even remember, but he said that's what we've got to focus on, the coming together of industrial and political struggles together. Because the industrial wage disputes, and we saw this last year in this country, when the nurses and the teachers asked for more money, I call it the Oliver Twist moment. Because when Oliver Twist in Charles Dickens' novel asks for more, they don't just say no, you can't have more. They beat him and throw him into slavery because they say, not that you asked for more, but you challenged my right to decide how much you get. So when the nurses and the teachers and others ask for more, the reason the state is so ferocious, and they say we can't afford it, of course they can afford it tomorrow. They don't want to afford it because what the teachers and nurses are saying is, we want to have a say in our own wages. And the state is saying, you cannot challenge my right as the government. I decide what you get paid. And so when I challenge for wages, I challenge the political decision-making system. And that's why they get so frightened. That's why the press turn on them. They turn on the leadership. If they can't get to the leadership, they turn on the members, they undermine it. And in the junior doctors' report, they virtually don't report it. They literally stopped reporting the fact that we had doctors on strike, because they didn't want to give publicity to the notion of it. So these are very, as you say, these are very serious matters. And that's why, as I said, telling the story is part of the struggle. Not just the struggle, but the getting sure that people hear it and hear their side. And you would think with social media that would happen, but it doesn't happen as much maybe as it should. And internationally as well. Sorry, yes, of course.
Well, the main struggle in this country, which I am living in this country, that's the reason I'm saying 50 years I'm here. Struggle become obsessed with the issue. Like, for example, let's say racism, let's say wage. Yes, I agree with you. You beautifully put it everything in the table. It was excellent. I mean, you started with the human nature, which is very, very important. But when the struggle is happening here, let's say 70% of the attention is very reformist.
Yes.
They are mad about mending the capitalism, like law needs to change here and there, this needs to be done, that needs to be done. I agree with that immediately. We need that. We need the national wealth. Because in front of us it is driven in a way. Yes, I can understand. But at the same time, it's a waste of time because we are swimming into water. The water itself is poisonous, which is capitalism. Majority are not like socialists, like many of us. Majority needs various fundamental things to be discussed. One of them is, for example, human nature. Human nature is not set, it's not given from God, or we are egoists, we are all egoists, that's it. When someone says that, it's very difficult to change the mind and discuss about the mode of production. People don't know the mode of production. What is mode of production? Unless they do start to understand that we are in the capitalist mode of production, and there was another mode of production before us and so on and so forth. And now, let's think about it, what is the next mode of production? Are we walking towards it, or are we escaping and going into the barbarism and turning back? That needs to be discussed. For example, I studied social anthropology. There was the first thing I learned, there was an American anthropologist, Margaret Mead. I mean, it's quite famous woman, 1925, I think, American. Went to the New Guinea and looked three different communities in New Guinea. There was a separation with the Sepik River between these three different communities. Sepik River has a specific issue. It's very fast because it is too fast moving like that. They can't navigate, so they never exchange any cultural exchange or anything other between these three communities. Completely different three sets of communities. Told me that unless you organize accordingly, you can create very different communities. One of them was ARAŞTIRMALARI, I never forget that, was a community. For example, you invite your near family as well as your friends and make a speech. You can say, I am really interested in 3 rooms, nice hut for myself, for my family, in just around this area. And then you go and start to work in another people's clothes. When you come back about 2 months after, your house is ready for you. But in this society, even the children never allowed to have a competitive games at all. So if there is a big ceremonies, they need a special people to be, from the childhood onwards, make them to fight each other, compete each other, taught a different style of living. They call Boumenian, and the Boumenians, around the age of 35, they become old. I mean, they are accepted as old, and they said, okay, you can stop when we have now new ones, and new ones start to be the Boumenian. In that sense, these Boumenians are so happy that they get rid of this job. This opened my mind. But Margaret went to the other society, the Gomor society, completely different society. Everybody kills each other with the babies and so. And then moved to the another one, Chambuli, male, lives in the arts-wise excellent houses. Women lives in the very moderate but very solid houses. They completely provide everything for the entire community, and the man is only does hairstyles, artistic works, metal or painting, and
almost like socialism.
When you look at those sort of things, then you open your mind and then you say, But each community, because we are small-scale societies, let's say about 2,000, 3,000 or something like that, and it is possible, but unless people do see that that is happening,
So this
these
is
are
basically
important.
about your starting point.
Yes, exactly.
Human nature.
Well, it's a, yes.
Their human nature, but at the same
So
time, what you
what do you
said,
say?
Well, it's the consciousness, it's
Yes,
the question
yes.
of being and consciousness. So the notion is that being, your material experience of life, decides your consciousness. And one of the arguments is that when you're in a trade union, you develop what we call trade union consciousness. That is, you understand that you have pay, conditions, promotion and so on, job security, and that you can fight the employer who's in here, who you can understand, you can see, and the solidarity that you're talking about, the unity comes from the fact you're all there, you've got a common employer, and you can see day in, day out that the employer is messing with your pay, your bonus, your incremental systems and so on. So that is trade union, and the trick, as we know, is to turn trade union consciousness into class consciousness, to understand it's not just you fighting your employer, but they're fighting their employer, and they're fighting their employer, and across the pond in America, they're fighting. So you join, and that's the movement from trade union. Now, what we're arguing is that is deliberately suppressed. So when the trade unions begin to get active, and we saw that last year when they were raising bigger questions, the teachers and the nurses saying it's not just about us, it's about the children, it's about the patients, it's about a broader consciousness. Whenever that's raised, it's suppressed, sometimes by the unions themselves, by the press, by the politicians, by the whole society. You mustn't muddle up, you mustn't become political, and so on. And they frighten people, don't they, into pushing it back. But it's a good sign, because they only behave like that because they know that if you can shift, as you're absolutely saying, people's consciousness from just a limited trade union to a broader one, that is terrifying to them. As I said, they're insecure because they know if we get our act together and if we can develop a broader, wider consciousness, then that's a threat to them. So they don't suppress us and dampen down our spirits just for the hell of it. They do it because they know how dangerous it is to them if they don't do it. But if I may just make the final point about reformism, the thing is, I mean, a lot of this is to do with de Tocqueville. You remember de Tocqueville?
yes,
De Tocqueville's thesis. So he was writing about when did the French Revolution, I mean, the world starts, as far as we're concerned, in 1789, the French Revolution. And he said, why did it take place in 1789 and not 5 years before? Because 5 years before, people were even poorer. So why weren't they angry? And de Tocqueville, the historian, said, they're so poor, things are so bad, they simply don't have the energy or the imagination or the spirit to fight. But in the 5 years between then and 1789, things got better. So people had a slightly easier life, so they could look up. And that's when the revolution comes. So the reformism is an answer to really tough conditions. As you said, incremental improvements look important. But if things are slightly better, people become more hopeful, they become more confident, and they win battles. And there's nothing in a struggle more important than winning. Because if you win, you show you can win. And I always use the smoking ban. People forget about the smoking ban. Most of my life, my boss smoked cigars. And I'd go into his office and I couldn't even see him. You know? And it was disgusting. It smelled, it was bad, you were coughing. And nobody wanted the smoking ban. The Labour Party didn't want it, the Conservative Party didn't want it, none of the newspapers wanted it, the big companies didn't want it, the cleaning companies didn't want it, the insurance companies, nobody wanted the smoking ban. And yet we had the smoking ban. And I remember when it came in, all the pub people and the restaurant people said we're going to go bust. It's going to ruin our business. You know. Now, can you imagine if you said we're going to reverse it? Can we say you can smoke at work and you can smoke in well, there'd be a riot because it's wonderful. It's a win-win. We're all healthier, it's cleaner, it's less smelly, it's less dangerous. It's a wonderful thing. But who did it? It was the doctors, workers, trade unionists, and others. The campaign, yes? They even bribed one of my most famous philosophers, a man called Roger Seifert, who was a famous professor of philosophy. And he wrote article after article and was on the telly all the time saying a smoking ban is an attack on freedom. It's an attack. If I want to smoke, I have the right to smoke anywhere. And he wrote all these articles. And then we found out that he'd been paid by a Japanese cigarette company to write them. So they were so desperate, they bribed a professor of philosophy to say this is an attack on British human rights. Yeah? So I use that as a wonderful example of community, trade unions, work, everybody coming together and beating the Labour, Tories, the business world. We beat them all. And it was a great benefit, But people don't want to talk because it showed a case study on how you could move low-level consciousness to a higher plane and feed, as you say, into the best things in human nature. So I think we mustn't forget that victory.
Where's Ben?
Like I said, you mentioned the changing composition of the working class and the need for kind of new modes of organising and struggle. What does that mean in concrete terms in kind of modern Britain in our workplaces and communities?
Well, it'd be who knows. Well, the first thing, the changing composition is important because, as I said, the working class were deliberately identified as manual workers who were then overwhelmingly male, and also manual workers in traditional occupations, so it was traditionally like the dock workers, so it would be white male jobs. So the industrial working class become associated with white male workers, the trade unions become associated with white male workers, and their behaviour, their tactics, like having committee meetings in pubs and drinking, and the drinking culture. And the notion was they fed off themselves, so they deliberately excluded women and other people from the meetings. And that was very damaging, because when the composition then changes, so there are no coal miners anymore, and factory workers have become white collar and so on, then the movement didn't catch up. So it was almost like a hierarchy. So when you get to the TUC, if you were representing factory workers, you were still seen as the top of the real, authentic working class struggle. And if you were a teacher or a badly paid civil servant, yeah, then you were seen as different. And I still remember people making speeches not that long ago, saying, you know, oh, we've got to organise the working class, but we can't rely on the teachers and the civil servants, you know. And the firefighters, the fire brigade union, who I used to do work for, they were very much of that attitude, the macho male thing. So what you get is a time lag, institutional time lags and cultural time lags. So you have an institutional and cultural model which then disappears. It's no use anymore, but it lingers on in the language and the organisation, even though the majority of workers now in trade unions in the public sector, which means by definition they're going to be white collar, are graduates. So 90% of doctors in a trade union and 10% of engineering workers in a trade union. Now we can't just say, well, we've got to recognise that that's the reality, that most trade unions are now graduates, white collar workers, and we have to adjust not just the recognition of that, but the way in which trade unions are organised. Some of the differences between them have to go. The language they use is still quite bad. I mean, it's only a few months ago, you know, 2 general secretaries were sacked for sexist, inappropriate sexual behaviour. Our friend Miguel and the others, Manuel, yeah, and your mates in the GMB. I mean, so they've still got some pretty bad things. So what we need is that to be root and branch. And it's not just a culturally sensitive behaviour. It's rooted in the realities of who your members are. Yeah. So that's the first thing. And we have to recognise the other thing was that it was very much about being an employee with a contract. But we know these groups of workers, as I said before, the Uber Eats and others, who are recently with the Deliveroo, where the court decided they were not employees. So that makes it, what does the trade union say? Well, the trade union should still embrace them. In fact, they have a rather dodgy trade union that organises them because Unite won't organise them. So there's still some very old-fashioned attitudes, and we've got to recognise, and we can't go back to what they call smokestack socialism. You know, I meet people who say they want to reopen the coal mines so we have a stronger trade union movement. I mean, you've got to be as mad as anything to say that. What? You want to send men down there and you want to pollute the atmosphere just so you have a few more trade union members? I mean, it's... So there's that. And then when you say the mode, well, the mode has to be related to that, doesn't it? It's got to be related to... For instance, one of the few benefits of COVID was trade union branches went online. Now, a lot of women still, when they leave work and go home, they've got to go home. They can't then go out again because of all sorts of other issues. So if they can sit at home and go to a branch meeting online, then the women participation rates and the general participation rates went up hugely. So things like that have to be embraced. And, you know, we could follow the French, which is sell huge buildings that our trade unions occupy. I put this to them recently and they didn't like it. But I said, flog them off. Why do you need these enormous, like Unison? You know, it's got the most enormous heckle. You don't need it anymore. Unite in Birmingham as well. You know, you don't need it. You don't need it. So there's a whole range.
They've still got Asia. They haven't got rid of it yet.
Haven't they got rid of Asia?
No, they haven't got rid of it.
Bloody hell! They've got a massive training complex.
Millions.
It's rather nice, actually. We did have some good times down there.
I don't remember that.
But yes, so I'm saying I think the unions, but also unions have to forge new links now. So some do form links with United, but I remember an Australian trade unionist years ago talking about green beans. I thought, why am I going to talk on green beans? But it was his Australian accent, and he was talking about green bands. That is, and the Australian Construction Workers Union had made alliances with the green movement to only agree to build in a way in which the buildings satisfied the requirements of lower energy. So he was actually saying bands. But I thought he was talking about green beans. I thought this is weird. So that, I mean, that's a good example of, but that then died. It went away, partly because the Green Party went mad, as you know, in many countries. But, you know, they have to forge it. Now, you know, there is a phrase in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar at the end where he says there is a tide in the affairs of men, which caught on the ebb. In other words, one of the things is, have we missed the tide? So your argument is, last year there was a high tide of trade union activity, and did we miss a wonderful opportunity to turn that into something more? Now it may be that all of that will vote the Tories out because of the public services. But did we miss it? So are we sometimes missing the moment because there's not always the right moment? But it's fascinating, fascinating. Sorry.
Sorry.
Nick, you are next.
In terms of what is to be done, which is the subject of this talk, seems to me that there's, I mean, we haven't really touched on what the key issue is. You talked about generalising the struggles of workers and so on. What is the mechanism for doing that? Traditionally, it's always been seen as the political party, a socialist party or communist party, is the way to bring together the different struggles and give a political complexion, have a strategic perspective and overview that points the way towards a different mode of production, towards socialism and so on. But these days, that instrument just isn't there anymore. In the last 15 years in this country, we've seen quite a number of different upsurges after the Tory Lib Con Dem government came into power and they upped student fees. There was a lot of demonstrations, quite a lot of violence, and there were riots. So there was, for a couple of years, there was almost a feeling of upright. There were putative uprisings happened. Then, when Corbyn looked like he could become leader of the Labour Party, you had a couple of 200 or 300 members, perhaps people who'd been politically educated in those upsurges that had happened before, joined the Labour Party and got Corbyn elected, which, to be frank, is the most remarkable political thing that's happened in this country for 50 years at least, if not more. That the party, the main opposition party that forms governments, was led by someone who came from the hard left, who had an anti-imperialist perspective, wasn't going to, if he became Prime Minister, wasn't going to automatically follow the coattails of the United States and take Britain to war. And obviously the establishment panicked. There was a huge campaign against him, and actually the defeat of Corbyn has been a huge defeat for socialists and the Labour movement in this country. But even despite that, and Starmer is the instrument of that defeat, so his election as Prime Minister will be a victory for the powers that be, if you like. I remain a member of the Labour Party, because that's where I still think the opportunity for struggle is there. The Labour Party, if you like, is the trade union party in this country, and it reflects both the strengths and the weaknesses of the trade union movement, because it's the trade unions which allow Corbyn to be defeated, that back up Starmer and allow him to do what he does. It's still, they've half the votes at conference, they pretty much control the NEC. Every time someone's expelled from the party, it's a panel of the NEC that rules on that, which will have trade union reps are deciding that left-wingers are being expelled or suspended. But despite those defeats, you've still recently had the trade union struggles that you spoke about last year, and you've got every weekend there's massive demonstrations about Gaza. So there is, the fight is there, but there isn't anything which is providing the strategic leadership for that struggle. So in terms of what is to be done, it's how do you build that instrument? How do you build the leadership is the key issue. And I haven't got any easy answers for that, but that's the question we have to ask ourselves.
No, absolutely. I mean, just quickly on that. I mean, firstly, I think that the problem with Corbyn, I mean, I know him, and I've known him since 1972, because I was acting in the same area he was. And the difficulty was a failure to recognise that what was behind his election and the support was a coalition. That it wasn't just a wedge of dedicated socialists behind him. It was a complex coalition that came together that put him there. And unfortunately, in the 2017 election, it was fine. 2019 election, he shifted both his domestic policies and his foreign policies. And I think he failed to recognise that the need to, if you like, be slightly more careful about the way in which he kept that coalition of interests together. And I think he fragmented it in the end by becoming too sectarian himself. So I think the spirit behind it, a lot of the people behind it are still there. And there's a lot of massive discontent with not just the Tories, but with British capitalism and the way in which it's functioning and the running down of the services is huge. I mean, the anti-Tory majority is massive now, and it's mainly around public services and the failure to deliver on that. So I do think that's important. I don't think we should become nostalgically hooked on the Corbyn issue, because that was, as you say, unusual. But so there's that, and then your point about injecting politics at the grassroots level, and that's very important. And that's where the unions have, a lot of the union leadership deliberately squeezed out the political stuff. Now, recently there's been we have to advertise this, a 6-volume official history of the transport. Okay, there's Unite funded and paid for a 6-volume official history of the Transport General Workers Union, and I wrote volume 2 of the 1930s and 40s. And one of the features of it was trade union education. And what happened was the all-powerful General Secretary, Ernest Bevin, opposed all forms of trade union education. And then the communists took it over. And suddenly he decided to massively fund trade union education, because by funding it, he could take it away. So the notion of injecting politics into trade unions and into community and other struggles is continuous. But we have to recognise, again, I always put it on its head and say, this is a good thing, because they're frightened of us. In other words, they're frightened of people putting politics in. They're frightened, as you said, of putting the notion that there's a socialist alternative. And there's a remarkably resilient support for a socialist alternative of sorts, not clearly defined, within the working class and the broader class within Britain. There's an amazingly resilient. So if you think about the propaganda going the other way, and the fact that they turned on Corbyn was that they were afraid. And as they keep saying, they didn't privatise gas, electricity, water because it was, and British Rail. They did privatise it because it was failing. They privatised it because it was succeeding. In other words, for all the frailties and faults of the public service sector, it was because British Rail was a decent railway system, but it was publicly owned, they had to show that it didn't work. It's a funny, the myth is that they privatised them because they were failing industries. No, they privatised them because they were succeeding industries, and they showed that public ownership works. And one of the best things that can happen at the moment is the failure of private water companies and private railway companies, and to some extent private dental companies, and the privatisation of the probation service. All these things the neoliberal were going to have all failed catastrophically. So I do believe in the worm turning, and the worm turns on the fundamental realities that people face, and people face terrible water companies, terrible railway companies, and they know it. There's not one person who doesn't know that it's the fault of the private rail companies, and there's a massive support for renationalisation. Now, nationalisation, for all its limitations under the reformism, is still a socialist building block, isn't it? So I'm much more optimistic, because I think actually the neoliberal stuff has failed. The Thatcher privatisation has failed manifestly. And most people, even though they don't always articulate it, see it, and they are terrified that people will come along and articulate the failures and link up the dots and say this is part of a socialist alternative, to say that public sector works better. I mean, for God's sake, EDF is a publicly owned French company. And it's going to run our nuclear power station. So we have a right-wing Tory government paying a nationalised French industry to run our electricity. I mean, it couldn't be more bizarre, could it? So I'm a bit more optimistic, and I'm a bit less pessimistic about Corbyn's defeat, because although it has, as you say, for the moment put us back on our heels and fragmented, the impulse that's put in there was a coalition around domestic politics. I'm not quite convinced about the international anti-NATO, anti-American politics. I mean, I'm convinced it was correct. I'm not convinced that it had the same broad support that his domestic policies. They haven't gone away. And whatever Starmer may or may not believe and do, he's a creature of politics. If he gets elected and he doesn't deliver, if he doesn't renationalise water, and after 2 or 3 years we've still got all these problems, he'll be in trouble. In fact, his best way of surviving is to nationalise water and rail. It really is. And I'm in talks with the railway unions and the teacher unions, and they're telling me that the shadow cabinet doesn't have very clear, detailed plans, and they are injecting into it and saying we can reform and improve, particularly the railways, through a form of nationalisation. And that the Labour people, whatever Starmer may say at the top, are open to it, because at the end of the day they want to deliver a better service. Because that's what people will notice. So I think it's difficult, as you say, and I know what is to be done. I didn't answer it, because like you, I can't really answer it. So, but trying to see little bits.
I think we need to stop, because I'm 8:30.
I need to go home.
So thank you very much again for
That's
this
a pleasure, brother. Thank you for inviting me.
presentation.